Good evening, and thank you all for attending the University of Richmond's 8th Last Lecture Series event, hosted by the Omicron Delta Kappa's Epsilon Circle. My name is Jack Schutzo, the ODK Epsilon Circle's president for this year, and I have the honor of introducing tonight's speaker. The concept of a last lecture comes from Carnegie Mellon University's late professor Randy Pausch, who delivered his last lecture titled Really Achieving Your Childhood Dreams on September 18th, 2007. In memory of Dr. Pausch, universities all over the country host last lecture series events where they ask esteemed professors to deliver lectures based on the following criteria. If you were to deliver a lecture that would be your last, what would you say? We are honored that Dr. Laura Knouse accepted our invitation to be this year's lecturer. Dr. Laura Knouse is Associate Professor of Psychology and Faculty Director of the Richmond Scholars Program at the University of Richmond. She is a clinical psychologist whose research and clinical expertise focus on the nature, assessment, and treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in adults. Dr. Knouse completed her clinical internship and postdoctoral fellowship at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. She specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, for adult ADHD, and she has published several research articles and chapters in this emerging area. Recent research projects are aimed at understanding the metacognitive difficulties of college students with ADHD in order to develop effective academic interventions and the role of mindsets in effective coping with ADHD. This summer, Dr. Knouse co-authored her first book in collaboration with Dr. Gil Robinson Hickman of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, entitled When the Leader Faces Personal Crisis, The Human Side of Leadership. Dr. Knouse teaches courses on psychopathology, ADHD, the principles of behavior and behavior analysis, as well as an FYS on the psychology of drugs. As an alumna of Westhampton College, she is passionate about mentoring students in her research lab, advising them for lives of purpose, and providing access to the benefits of a Richmond education to the next generation of scholars. Dr. Knouse, thank you for being here, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you, Jack. All right, got to onboard this technology. Excellent. Well, thank you for having me this evening. This is truly a privilege. When we train our students to think critically, one thing we do is that we encourage them to consider the source. And so I'd like to start by giving you a few facts about me to aid you in this process. Some disclosures. I am a cisgender, white, straight, upper middle class, married mother of 2 children who has a PhD in clinical psychology. Therefore, I am a psychologist, and no, I am not analyzing you. Yet. I'm also a radical behaviorist who espouses functional contextualism. Or maybe those are all just a bunch of big words that I use to make myself feel a little bit safer standing up here in front of you. But by any estimation, I am privileged. And one consequence of that privilege is the fact that I get to stand up at the front of this room saying something as though what I have to say is going to have value. But really, only you can be the judge of this. Only your own experience can tell you. And so I'm extra grateful that you've taken the time today to listen to what I have to say. I am also an alumna of this university, and I'm deeply concerned about our well-being as a community. As the text of a choral piece that I've been learning recently says, my bones are vexed, although we sing it vexed. I think we should use the word vexed a lot more. And so I hope that what I have to say today might go a little ways towards turning our hearts in some different directions at the University of Richmond as members of our community. I believe that we can be doing better by ourselves and by one another, and that it's too urgent to wait for anyone else to do this for us. So, in addition to being all that other stuff and all those other terms that I've mentioned, I also happen to be a person. And my thesis statement today is that being a person is hard. I want you to notice, though, what I'm not saying. I am not saying that all people have it equally hard. I am not saying that all people and their struggles are pretty much the same. I'm also not saying that being a person is inherently harder than being a non-human animal, nor am I saying that being a person is ultimately nothing but meaningless hardship. But when you reflect on the idea of being a person is hard, I wonder what's going through your mind. I'm a psychologist, right? That's what I wonder about all the time. So maybe your mind is giving you, when I say being a person is hard, it's throwing up to you all kinds of personal and not personal examples of how humans and groups have had it hard over time. And maybe your mind is saying to you, aha, I recognize this. There's something that feels true to me about this. Or maybe your mind is saying, yeah, okay, so what? Or perhaps your mind is saying, I really should have peed before this thing started. And being a person is hard. That's what I get to say anytime something crazy happens in this talk. This is the whole point of this, right? Being a person is hard. I have no way of knowing, but being a person is hard. Before I go much further, though, I have to do another good scholarly thing, which is to acknowledge all of the sources for the ideas in this talk, including the works of B.F. Skinner, and particularly the work of Dr. Stephen Hayes and colleagues on contextual behavioral science, then is instantiated in a form of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. So there's lots of resources. If the ideas in this talk are interesting to you, there are ways to learn more. So, one way that being a person is clearly hard is that we have these obnoxious physical bodies that break down and get cold and get tired and have to pee and make sounds and smells that are inconvenient and unpleasant and can be quite literally a pain in the ass. And that sucks and that's hard. And another way that being a person is hard is that we do this thing where we inflict pain, oppression, and insults on one another, physical and mental, profound and petty. In fact, when we think that we have been wronged, or when we feel we're in a state of deprivation, it actually feels good, or what psychologists call it is reinforcing for us to inflict pain on others. This is an ugly state of affairs, but it's also one that we share with our non-human animal beings on this planet. In fact, there's a study that I talk about to my students in Principles of Behavior, a very interesting animal research study, where you're doing experiments with pigeons, and if you cut off their supply of food, they will actually work hard to gain access to another pigeon so that they can physically abuse it, even when that pigeon had nothing to do with that state of deprivation. But laying aside our non-human animal friends, my main assertion today is that humans get to suffer in extra special ways that our non-human animal friends cannot. So here's kind of a silly example to illustrate what I'm talking about. So here are some non-human animals. We're equal opportunity here for our cat and our dog lovers. And I'm just going to add some things to this image and see kind of what you think about it. Okay. So what's up with this? Why is this funny? What does this tell us about what might be the case for human suffering? Well, another set of compelling facts is that people in developed nations have more ways to tweak our physiologies and psychologies to fit the environment to our desires than have any humans in history. And yet, in developed nations, specifically the US, lifetime rates of psychological disorders are at 50% or more. More than half of us will think about suicide as a solution to our problems during our lifetime. All of us suffer self-doubt, dissatisfaction, malaise, living lives of quiet desperation at one time or another. We can have all of our physical needs met and still be miserable. We can achieve the heights and still find ourselves wanting. But so far, what has psychology and psychiatry's answer often been to explaining the source of psychological suffering? Well, there have been many explanations, but one explanation is essentially broken brains. In other words, physical or psychological abnormalities that account for signs and symptoms that we call suffering. But I'm here today to do something pretty risky, and that's to call bullshit on my own discipline. Because given the data about the entirety of human suffering, that just doesn't make sense as a through-going explanation. If psychological suffering is always and only a result of a set of disease states, then our treatment should be more effective. I've come to believe, as Hayes and others in my field believe, that we have been sold what is called the myth of healthy normality. This myth says that health and happiness are the normal state of affairs for humans. And if this is the case, it means that suffering is therefore a sign of abnormality. And the idea has been that thoughts, feelings, problematic behaviors, self-doubt, and mental anguish are best understood as the result of some anomalous brain condition or chemical imbalance. Now notice what I am not saying. I am not saying that abnormal brain functions are not relevant to behavior and to many psychological disorders. We can list them all: ADHD, major depression, autism, schizophrenia. I am also not saying that medication and other biomedical treatments cannot be valid or useful in the relief of human suffering. Do not come for my Lexapro, I will cut you. And I don't care if it's only a placebo effect. Doesn't matter in the slightest. But what I am saying is, what if the processes at the root of much human suffering are the same processes that are endemic to being human? What if the root of human suffering is baked into the same functions that have helped us to survive and thrive as a species? This certainly wouldn't be the only example. There are numerous other instances in which an adaptive trait or capacity has made its way into our genotype and our phenotype, that's our genes and the way those genes are expressed, but happens to be less advantageous or even disadvantageous in our modern context to individual humans. So I always think of this example when I walk into D Hall. This is a sight we all see. Yes. So I always ask my students, why do we like salt and fat? Why do we like the D Hall dessert bar? And they say, because it tastes good. I'm like, why? Why does it taste good? Somebody help me. If this were a real lecture, I would be doing a lot more of the Socratic stuff, so I'm going to need some responses. Okay. Why do we like desserts? Why do we like sweet? How do we know what's sweet? It's pleasure. Why is it pleasurable? Dr. Lambert, please help me.
We're predisposed to eat sugar because it's good for some extent.
Yes. Yeah. So those ancestor animals or beings that were more motivated by things that were high in calories, that tasted sweet and fatty, were differentially, back in our history, more likely to survive and reproduce. And so that's the explanation, that we like these things because we were shaped by these really old environments, right? But now we're in the modern environment where this is just sitting around. Like, I don't have to work too hard for that, right? And so that's where the disadvantage comes from, that mismatch of sort of my genes with my environment. And so my thing, with all due respect to celery, sorry, celery. Celery is sad. So we have these other examples, but what might the mysterious capacity that I keep referring to with respect to human suffering, what might that be? Well, one clue is that I'm doing it right now, and you're doing it right now in your head, and with all sincere apologies to my dear Matt Lauder, psycholinguist friend, Hayes and colleagues say that this process is languaging. In other words, symbolic verbal evaluative behavior. This is a capacity that we have that animals don't have. And obviously, it's something that has brought our species the greatest capacities for technological innovation, cooperative action. It's led to complex societies, breathtaking art, soul-stirring poetry, so many benefits. But it has also given us access to the most self and other destructive ideas and habits of mind. We can verbally label, extend, give meaning to, and replay past painful events ad nauseum. We can easily connect those events to our current experience and then bring them to mind with ease. We then project those past events into our futures, and we can worry about those imagined futures that may never come to pass. We can dehumanize ourselves and others in an effort to avoid the implications of our actions toward one another. We can always conceive of how it could be better, which means it might never be good enough. And all of this is simply exhausting. Thanks, language. We're so used to languaging that we can also get really wrapped up in our thoughts and judgments and then treat those thoughts and judgments as though they were facts in the world. And then those thoughts dictate our behaviors in ways that can be self-fulfilling. Furthermore, our languaging habits can convince us that the approach we take to fixing things in the physical world should work just as well for the world between the ears. So for example, the rule, if I don't like something, get rid of it, works great for a paragraph you're trying to edit, or the color of your bedroom wall that you don't like, or even that dead-end job that you want to change. But it doesn't work so well, that rule, if you don't like something, get rid of it, for things like thoughts and feelings. In my psychopathology classes, I often do an example. We can do it real quick, a little simulation. So I would ask you to think to yourself in your head, how many times in the past week have you thought about a white bear? Now, what if I said for the next 3 minutes, we're all going to sit in silence and we're all going to focus our collective mental, physical, and spiritual energies on doing everything except thinking of a white bear? You're trying to get rid of it, right? How many times would you think of the white bear? A million times, right? So it's like if you don't want something, you're going to have it when it comes to thoughts and feelings. So sometimes in an effort to escape and tamp down painful thoughts and feelings, we act in ways that paradoxically perpetuate those experiences. And then we also do this thing where we language in ways that set up rules and arbitrary limitations. So here's an example of a good rule, an if-then construction. Let's see what we could fill in here. Our brains love to language, and then we think that thinking is the way out of every psychological paper bag. And so being a person is hard because we have this unique ability to create suffering using our mind tools of languaging, evaluating, and judging, exactly what our minds were designed to do in the first place. Kind of a downer, right? I feel like pretty depressing, right? Or does some little part of you maybe feel weirdly, strangely hopeful when you hear this, a little validated, as we psychological types like to say? Isn't that weird? I have just told you that the propensity for suffering might be baked into fundamental, unwindable human processes. So maybe you're thinking, okay, well, she's a psychologist, especially a clinical psychologist, so clearly she's here to give me some answers that are going to make me feel better. Well, that seems logical. Congratulate your mind on its superior deductive reasoning skills. Good job using language to predict the future mind, just as we might expect. But maybe there's something else there, something fundamentally meaningful about the idea that psychological suffering might just be a basic characteristic of what it means to be human. What else comes up when you think about that? What does your experience tell you about that? I invite you to stay curious. So I think one upshot of the idea of psychological suffering being universal and expectable could be that it allows us to more fully embrace a controversial idea. And that is this idea that people are doing the best that they can. Now notice what I am not saying. I am not saying that people shouldn't experience the consequences of their actions. I am not saying that everyone's behavior is permissible and acceptable. I am not saying that people are incapable of change or that right now is as good as it gets. So what am I saying? Well, for one thing, I'm expressing an idea that flows directly from my worldview as a radical contextual behavioral scientist. Let me break that down. Behaviorists believe that all behaviors are caused. Although in many cases, the causes of behavior are so complex as to not be fully knowable for every individual behavior, behaviorists believe that the causes of all behaviors are potentially knowable and understandable in the service of predicting behavior and changing it. As a behaviorist, I believe that the causes of behavior can be found in the organism's environments, both past and present, interacting with and constrained by its genes. Past environments and experiences, which we behaviorists refer to as an organism's learning history, strongly influence behavior, as do the contingencies that are operating in the here and now. And the role of genes in building physical bodies that constrain or enable behavior and species-specific behavioral tendencies is undeniable. But what do I mean by radical? Am I going to picket in the streets? in favor of behaviorism? Well, maybe. But what radical really means here is it means that this view of behavior is all-encompassing of behaviors and includes both private behaviors only observable to the behaving person themselves. Things like thinking, dreaming, imagining, and visualizing are conceived of as behaviors that can be studied just like observable behaviors. So a more earlier form of behaviorism that people might be familiar with is this idea that behaviorists don't think thoughts and feelings exist. It's actually not. There are some that think we shouldn't study them because they're too sticky. Those are called methodological behaviorists. Radical behaviorists say they exist, we can study them. They just look a little bit different than some other behaviors we can observe. And finally, by contextual, I mean that the unit of analysis is the entire behavior in its unique context. The meaning and function of a behavior can't be divorced from the events that occur around it. Put another way, two bits of behavior can look identical but have entirely different functions depending on the context. So for example, saying, "Oh, I'm a terrible person," sarcastically to my husband, "Hey Steve," after I forget to close my dresser drawer. We go around the house all the time like we do some little stupid thing. I'll be like, "Oh, I'm a terrible person." It's a different context than, "Oh, I am a terrible person," said to myself in my own head as I review in my mind all the times that I judge I've let people down or not lived up to my own values. So it's not what a behavior looks like that's important. It's the function that it serves for the individual in a given situation, whether that behavior contributes to what Hayes calls successful working. Okay, but let me crawl out of the weeds. What does this all mean with respect to the idea that people are doing the best that they can? Well, our good friend B.F. Skinner, the grandpappy of radical behaviorism, addressed the key question of whether a behavior that has occurred in the past could have been different. And his view was that, from a behavioral perspective, this question doesn't even make sense. Because for a particular behavior, given the organism's learning history, its behavioral capabilities at the time, the stimuli present in the environment, and if a human, the knowledge that the human had at the time, it led to the only possible behavioral outcome that was possible, which was the behavioral outcome that was. However, a deep understanding and analysis of those circumstances surrounding behavior can lead directly to methods to predict and influence future behaviors. And so this way of looking at behavior is perpetually forward-looking. This is the stuff of a field called applied behavior analysis, which uses the principles of behavior to change the lives of many. I teach about ABA in my Principles of Behavior class, and my students practice it during the course by attempting to analyze and change one of their own behaviors. Some of them do successfully change their behavior, but all of them learn that behavior change is hard, it is not to be taken lightly, and it is to be undertaken with humility and compassion for oneself and for others who struggle with behavior change. Now, some of the more, shall I say, chronologically gifted colleagues in the audience may have blanched when I confessed, nay, stated proudly, that I am a radical behaviorist, because their minds might associate this worldview with an impersonal, mechanistic, non-humanistic way of viewing people and their capacity for change. In practice, it's my argument that nothing could be further from the truth. The deep and abiding belief underlying applied behavior analysis is that with the right experiences and learning opportunities, people, regardless of their prior capacities, are capable of learning new, life-giving, functional behaviors. And therefore, change is always possible. I believe it's a deeply humanistic worldview, which places the responsibility for behavior change on the analyst, the teacher, and those in power who control the environment as much as it does on the pupil. It is a field that refuses to accept the limitations placed upon certain people with certain diagnoses, physical or mental limitations, and histories. If you are feeling pessimistic about the human condition, I recommend you hang out with some behavior analysts. They are a happy bunch. After all, if all behaviors are caused and we're ultimately the product of our learning histories and our current circumstances, then that means that experience can always become a new part of our history, and new environments can become the catalyst for change. Change is always possible. The capacity to learn from experience is perhaps nature's greatest adaptation. So what does this mean to believe and practice the idea that people are doing the best that they can? I think it means doing the hard move of understanding without blaming, of seeking restitution without retribution. It doesn't mean that we don't respond to behavior with consequences. In fact, it's often immoral not to respond to behavior with meaningful consequences. But it means that in choosing those consequences, we're curious enough about our fellow humans to try to figure out the most effective way forward. In other words, we are sometimes more interested in being effective than in being right. What would this mean, for example, for our criminal justice system if our collective efforts were aimed at figuring out what experiences and environments actually enabled people to change problematic behaviors? Is there any universe in which our system would look the way it does if that were the goal? But remember, it is reinforcing to punish. It feels good to us, whether or not that punishment is effective. And so assuming that people are doing the best that they can requires us to stay our judgment, increase our curiosity, interest, and engagement with others, and to commit to being a part of a solution. But here's the trick, and this is the hardest part for maybe, this is the hardest part for some other people in this room. People are doing the best that they can. People, that includes you. You are doing the best that you can. Sorry. You have always done the best that you could in the moment, given what you experienced before, the skills you had to that point, and the situation that you found yourself in. Is that hard for anyone else to hear? Oh, I never cried at this part before. There's more crying parts coming up. How am I going to do it? Is it easier in some situations to extend mercy and grace to others, to accept that people can make mistakes more easily than to say, I made a mistake? Why is this? What's up with that? So I've been thinking about it. I think it has something to do with this idea that we feel we know ourselves better than we know other people. And since we're the one acting, that we should be able to know ourselves and predict our own behavior. Basically, we feel like we should be able to control our thoughts, feelings, and actions at all times. And I say this to my students sometimes, and they sometimes like, oh, how does she know what I'm thinking? I say, are you worried that if you let yourself off the hook, what would happen if you let yourself off the hook and showed a little compassion even for a moment? What if we lost that precious control? I say to them, are you going to magically become a slacker? Wave the magic slacker wand? Degenerate? Underachiever? I don't know. But that desire to control is often the problem, isn't it? So in trying to control what's inside our heads and our hearts, we stop living, taking risks, and trying for those things that really matter to us. If only I had X, I would Y. Because being a person is hard. People are doing the best that they can. But I'm not here to be fatalistic, not in the slightest, because I believe that given supportive learning experiences and situations, everyone can live a vital life. So what do I mean by a vital life? When I say vital, I mean one that feels connected to others, to a cause, to a goal, to a source of meaning, to some kind of engine of motivation that sustains you. Maybe not all the time, but enough so that you can get through the hard stuff and make a life that's worth it. I really began to seriously consider what is needed for a good and vital life, like in a way that involved clearing away some substantial psychological bullshit, when what I thought was one of my worst fears happened to me. My son was diagnosed with the A word. Both times that I was pregnant, I would think about my future child, and I would always ponder how I thought I could probably cope with myriad physical or mental or other disabilities, cerebral palsy, deafness. Heck, Down's kids, they struggle, right? But they're typically affectionate and socially connected to others. But that A word, I always felt as though I wouldn't be able to cope with having an autistic child, one that I assumed would be in his own world and surely wouldn't be capable of giving back the love and affection that I would pour into him. Well, thanks, mind, for that thought. Thanks for trying to protect me. That's your job, and I appreciate it. But I wish you'd been a little quicker to warm up to learning from experience when at the end of a period of uncertainty, I heard the words, your son has autism spectrum disorder. And I was so afraid for him for so long. My beliefs about what that diagnosis would mean were so scary. But then my experience started to tell me something different. It turns out, and those of you who know the autism community can complete this, you've met one person with autism. You've met one person with autism. This is my son. He is incredibly snuggly when he feels like it and when he trusts you. He has some trouble languaging in English/human. My husband always says Craig's first language is his second language. He is a complete goofball. He is odd and eccentric. His current obsession is elevators. He could tell you where any elevator is on this side of campus and what pattern the buttons are in, and he knows all of the things. He can also play all the sound effects from all versions of Windows on our piano at 7 in the morning sometimes, right outside our bedroom. It's fun. That's fun. He is often fearful. He's sensitive to loud noises and change. He often struggles and acts out when he's emotionally overwhelmed. And we don't know, he might live with us forever, which is actually fine. We kind of like him. And he's infinitely fascinating. He is loved by adults and peers that surround and accept him. And he did my mind at the service of breaking down my screwed up assumptions about what you need to live a happy life. And he laid bare my ego-fueled desires to have this good kid, to have a traditionally smart kid, or to always have the well-behaved kid, and to focus on those things that I think really matter when you come right down to it. A means to meet physical and security needs, a way to feel connected to others, and meaningful work and play. And pleasure. There's nothing inherently wrong with pleasure. I think hedonism gets a bad rap. And that's it. If you're on that train, I think you're good to go. Who knows? Everything else might just be bullshit. But what does your experience tell you? Mine tells me that with the right environments and experiences, everyone can live a vital life, regardless of your past, regardless of your mistakes, and often because of them. But how do we get there? I think it makes sense to start talking first about how we don't get there. I'm pretty sure we don't get there by trying to eliminate the experience of pain and negative emotions in our lives. I don't think we get there by avoiding the things that make us feel unsure, anxious, and vulnerable. We don't get there by spending a lot of time in considerable headspace trying to look okay to everybody or trying to make ourselves feel the right way. Because here's the thing, in the course of living a vital life in line with your values, unpleasant feelings and thoughts will occur. And furthermore, we know from psychology that you can't erase past memories, thoughts, and feelings. There is no unlearning, there's only new learning. There's nowhere for these experiences to go, and so the best you can do is create new ways of relating to your history, your thoughts, and your feelings. But it is not easy. It is hard, and we need help doing it. Because being a person is hard. But one thing that we have to do in order to move towards a vital life is to actively choose what a vital life means to each of us. As Jon Kabat-Zinn puts it, what is my job on this planet with a capital J? And no one else can choose your values for you. You're going to be influenced by others, of course, and you might be unsure about what values mean to you at a given point in your life. And what a valued, vital life means will change throughout your life. But one gift that language gives back to us is this ability to construct and describe what matters most to us. To sort of describe and understand what kinds of actions move us in the direction of the compass point and which move us away. But that path is not always linear, students. I'm just going to tell you right now. And if there's anything we mentors can do for our students, it's to communicate plainly that our paths were fraught with twists and turns and serendipity and disappointment and triumph and shame. And to speak the truth that learning involves taking risks, and there are times when you hit it big, while you always have to accept the probability of imperfection. In other words, show the world that you're a person too. Giving others a window on your own authentic struggle, your vulnerability, is one experience that can free others to choose a vital life for themselves. But now, what does all this pie in the sky musing mean for what we actually do and what we do here at the University of Richmond? Where might we go here if anything I've said has touched your heart or mind? What could we do collectively as a community? So notice here that I use verbs in parentheses as a placeholder for action. because we're just not going to language ourselves out of this one. A few ideas. Experience will show whether they have value or not. I'd love it if we could create and protect opportunities for individual and collective reflection on values and goals. Choosing what matters to you is necessary for thoughtful action in the direction of your values, and no one can do that work for you. Experiences like reflective writing, conversations with mentors and peers, and quiet contemplation may support this action. So too will access to and willingness to engage in a variety of experiences, whether or not those experiences will build your resume or fit whatever narrative you've already been constructing for yourself. But here's the rub. When we engage in reflection, experimentation, and creative thought, it can look like we're not doing anything, when in fact, we are doing what is necessary to make all of our actions really count. So as a community, we must create space and time for these practices and praise and reward those who engage in them. Relatedly, and close to my heart, as a community, we must continue to value and support nonverbal activities and ways of knowing. Listening to and playing or singing music, engaging in physical activity, creating art, moving through nature and space, dancing. These activities allow us to quiet our languaging minds and learn from our experiences. I think we can also try to continue to create experiences and situations where growth is rewarded, meaning that screwing up is an expected part of learning. For example, many students, myself included as a younger person, are raised in environments that punish errors and reward well-defined correct answers. And sometimes that punishment just comes in the form of the anxious reactions of parents or teachers. And then we're perplexed when students struggle to become creative, learning-oriented risk takers. Faculty are likewise socialized in systems that require production on a schedule in the context of a tidy professional narrative. And then we similarly expect them to be creative, free-thinking innovators. And I am sometimes afraid that in valorizing excellence, we communicate the expectation that one should be excellent in public ways across each and every one of an ever-multiplying array of roles and expectations. Such churn can leave us depleted and anxious instead of engaged, strategic, and fully present, those qualities that actually support excellent scholarly and creative activity. Thus, in other words, the processes we're setting up might run counter to the outcomes we desire. So in my opinion, it's the processes, not the people, who should change. In addition, we have to ask ourselves, individually and collectively, what are the rules that we are following without question? Rules are useful. They allow us to avoid bad things without having to actually come in contact with bad things. But the rules we receive from others can also limit experiences and opportunities. For example, my dad always used to say, finish what you start. A great rule in many instances, right? But is following this rule always the wise choice? I mean, surely there are instances where the on-the-ground information we have about a situation would suggest that we should switch strategies or even leave a particular goal completely abandoned. So rules can operate at the individual level or the group or organizational level. And organizations often have these unseen rules that constitute what we call organizational culture. So when Jack introduced me, he talked about some of the work I've been doing recently on leaders in crisis, and it gave me this great opportunity to read a lot about organizational culture and different psychologies of how we work here in the United States. So for example, raise your hand if you've heard of the Protestant work ethic concept. Okay, so in a Western, if you haven't, that's cool, I'm gonna tell you what it is. For example, many organizations in a Western context reward people who adhere to this Protestant work ethic. And I found the most glorious quotation from this wonderful publication that's called Outlier Nation, The Cultural Psychology of American Workways. And it goes like this, I'm gonna read it. The Protestant ethic moralizes and valorizes, and I added the emphasis, work done for non-instrumental reasons. A good person is expected to work hard and for long hours, even when he or she has no material need to do so. So just that underlined part felt like the most absurd thing you've ever seen. No instrumental reason. And we often have this, like, if working is good, then not working is bad. Yes, that's what our minds tell us, of course. Isn't that actually pretty ludicrous? Like, why would we find something that's actually not benefiting anyone and might be harming the worker praiseworthy? But that's a rule that we kind of follow. And we look at that and we're like, haha, that's silly. But how many of us will admit to responding to the pressure of this culture of busyness? Students, why so many roles listed on that email signature line? It's like 9 lines long. What is wrong with one major? One major is okay. Why do you humble brag to each other about how many hours you spent studying in the library? And I know if you're on that first floor of Boatwright, you are not studying, but that's okay. Maybe you're relaxing. Or bragging about how little sleep that you got last night. Faculty and staff, we don't get let off the hook either. Do you perversely feel somehow more worthy when you work nights or weekends? Especially if someone sees that email coming from you at like 1 a.m. You're like, now I'm a really good person. Is even your free time diminished in quality because you feel guilty for not working, or you are thinking about the things that you should be doing, so it's not fun anyway? And administrators, does it often feel like your value is counted in the number of new initiatives you launch, the number of meetings you hold, or the number of reports that you generate? Now, rules are all well and good when they contribute to valued outcomes, and sometimes you have to follow the rules, even if they don't touch your most deeply held values, just to get through the day or to get to experiences that will be more meaningful. Not every experience in life is going to be a mountaintop. But habitually behaving according to rules without reflecting on them means that we can be blind to what our own experience is actually telling us. In other words, we can fail to be present in our own decision-making, and we can miss important information that would lead us in a different value direction. At the institutional level, we must continue to have sincere and honest conversations about what are our true goals and values. Is what we say we are about, our values, actually reflected in our institutional practices and in the images that we project to the world? If we were truly about growth, what would our practices look like? If we were about living vital lives, what would they look like? Can we use our mind tools to imagine different practices and make them real? I'm confident we can. And each of us can be part of the experiences of others and the situations that foster these changes in doing. So I want to thank you for your time today. I know I didn't tie up all of the loose ends for you because, frankly, that would be pure hubris on my part. But I want to leave you with a few words. Think of them as a secular benediction of sorts. We are all a work in progress. And life is long, but life is also short, and we do not have much time to gladden the hearts of those who journey this way with us. What should we do? Be swift to love, make haste to be kind, because being a person is hard. Thank you.